When it comes to the discipline of ETL, sometimes we get in the habit of equating ETL with a specific tool set. For me, coming from a SQL Server background, immediately SSIS jumps to mind. A lot of the guys I work with are big fans of Informatica, and there's lots of other ETL tools out there. And when we conceptualize populating a Redshift data warehouse, immediately we'll probably also start thinking that we need to work that into our existing ETL processes somehow. And that's true, but don't lose track of the fact that Redshift is a different platform. It's got its own needs and its own architectural designs, plus it's based in the cloud. So if you haven't done a lot of ETL work with cloud-based platforms, you're going to want to think about some things a little bit differently. Now, AWS as a whole makes life really easy for any kind of development effort, and really ETL still is a software development discipline. For me, being a .NET guy, I can come right here and download SDKs for .NET. If you work with JavaScript or Java itself or Python or Ruby or any other number of languages, chances are there's not only an SDK but all kinds of documentation and sample code that can show you how to connect to your AWS resources. Now, if you're used to doing your ETL with a pre-built tool such as Informatica and just wiring up mappings, I'd recommend at least approaching some of these tasks like a programmer, or at least thinking of them in a scripting type approach. Now, don't worry if you don't have a background in development. There's also connectors here for PowerShell and just the simple command line. And honestly, my preference is the command line. It's a very simple approach, and for what I want to do getting data into my Redshift platforms, I've found it to be not only the most simple, but also very fast and easy to work with. Whether you're working in a Windows environment or a Mac, or even a Unix environment, all you have to do to work through the command line is download the Amazon CLI, which is their command line interface, and install it. Once you've done that, the learning curve is really simple and you can be up and running quickly. Now, if you need to do something a little bit more fancy, you'll download an SDK. Like I said earlier, for me it would be .NET, and I can access all of that here, including documentation and all kinds of sample code. Now, to safely and securely work with AWS, I want to set up an IAM role, much like we did to connect Redshift to that S3 bucket. So I go back into the IAM dashboard, click on Users, and then I'll give this a name that kind of makes sense for what we're doing, Redshift ETL. Now, as far as giving it permissions, you'll give it permissions to really whatever AWS service you want to interact with. Specifically for my purposes, I'm going to connect to S3. Cutting to the chase here, what I'm going to do with my ETL processes is automate the uploading of files into an S3 bucket and then load from there, just like we've done. Because frankly, that is the best way to get data into your Redshift cluster, unless you're going to do something like set up a stream, which we'll show in the next demo. Now, that doesn't preclude us from doing heavy transformations or business logic or any other kind of programming, moving data from whatever our source is to ultimately our destination, which is that Redshift cluster. We'll just have the added step of moving data into an S3 bucket right before we do that preload. So let me show you how I would put that together. We've already created the S3 bucket. Now we have an account that can connect to that bucket. So let's go ahead and build an ETL process using the tool that I'm familiar with, SSIS. Now, this concept would work with whatever ETL tool that you're using, or if you're going to do a pure coding approach, any SDK that you're using as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I want to make sure that I have the command line set up properly. I already downloaded that CLI install and set it up off screen. So from a command line, all I have to do is type AWS config. Now, I did this already too, and I'm not going to do it here because ultimately you would end up seeing my user credentials and keys and things which are sensitive. But if you were to click enter, you'd get 3 prompts. And basically it's just asking for those authorization details of that user that we just set up. Now, once you set those up, they are stored locally, at least if you're on a Windows system, in these 2 files here in the default area, users, and then your username, and then a .aws folder that you can find right on your computer. Now, these are just basic ASCII text files, so you can edit them directly if you need to change users or change keys or switch region details. And since those are already in place, I can go ahead and back up and instead just type the command. I want to test uploading a file to S3. And that command is as simple as declaring AWS, which puts me into that command line interface. This is an S3 command. CP stands for copy. I'll give it the source file, where it's headed, By now you should be real familiar with that Redshift load queue bucket that I have on S3. And looks like I did everything right because it uploaded just fine. All right, so let's build a quick SSIS package.